the Rogers Road area mitigation options and landfill closure impacts. Manager Clifton is identified.
Yes. We've got a couple of PowerPoint slides that we want to run through real quickly just as we go into discussions to give you, you should have had them delivered to you. I don't know if you did or not, but we just want to point out a couple of things for you to start out with. Flip to the first one, Michael. If you'll look at this drawing, this is the Rogers Road area, roughly a 3/4 mile boundary around the landfill property, and that speaks to the issue of the illegal dump sites, and that's the designated area that we're talking about when we talk about servicing or a plan for addressing the illegal dump sites. And that's roughly 3/4 area, 3/4 of a mile area around the landfill site. The next drawing, please. Next. As we talk about the Rogers Road area, the areas in blue, and I'm sorry, this thing doesn't seem to, the areas in blue or light blue are the original Rogers Road area. If you'll see some of this line, you can hardly see it on the, you'll see the scale over here. This area that's in a light tan is the Fox Meadow area, and in an area up there a little bit above that is another area we'll talk about in sewer. When we talk about water services for the area associated with the Rogers Road community, we're talking about the $4 million includes the blue areas where services are not now hooked up or not now available, and this subdivision. And as we talk about that, the reason as we developed this plan, if you only dealt with the traditional Rogers Road neighborhood, you had this area, and I can't remember exactly how many houses in there, but the reality of it is you would have created an area that provided water service and left an area isolated that the areas around it have water service. And then when we talk about sewer as a total, it includes this area up above, the Rogers Road area, and then also the Fox Meadow area. Next slide, please. And when we talk about the annual tipping fee, if, as we discussed, and you went as far as January 2017, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, the fee would increase legally within the agreement by 10% a year. By January 2013, you'd be charging $89 a ton at the gate. Those are revenue streams producing, and they accumulate. So theoretically, if you stayed open through January 2017, you could generate an additional $5 million. I do need to point out, flip back please. I do need to point out to you, but those numbers are based on 50,000 tons a year, and last year the tonnage declined by 10,000, by 10%, 5,000 tons. So that decline of 10% roughly equals the revenues you raised by increasing the rates. Next slide, please. This is, as we talk about, those are the potential funding sources within the both the increase in tipping fees, the fund balance you appropriated last year. Next slide, please. These, and I want to point this out because we're going to talk about this in much more detail, are the existing gate fees at these landfills. $38 a ton in Alamance, $45 a ton in Caswell, $42.50 a ton in Durham, $30 a ton, which is a private landfill in Person County, and then $72 a ton for a private transfer station down in Chatham County. Those were recently acquired by Mr. Talbot, and that we'll be referring to those. I'll be referring to those as I go through the report. It is hard. If you go back to the original map, I appreciate it. The blue and okay, that one there. I need to point out to you, the board, before you went on break, asked us to do a thorough analysis, and you acted to increase the tipping fee, and we did by the amount authorized in the agreement, which is 10% annually. The county has the authority to increase the tipping fee. During the time between you did that action and this meeting, we've met, the attorneys have met, the county staff has met. We've had a lot of discussions. Now, I need to tell you that regardless, it is hard to separate the landfill, solid waste issues from the Roger Road discussion, both emotionally and financially. The implications are what they are, and I need to go through a couple of relevant points before we go to the meeting package and discuss the recommendations. First of all, the analysis, and I need to say this, we've done a great deal of analysis that realistically probably should have been done years ago. We've gone back into historic files. We've pulled down at one point in time when the county took over the landfill operation, assumed the landfill operations. The MSW, and we talk tonight, when we talk about the landfill tonight, we're talking about the MSW landfill, the household waste. Across the street from the MSW is a C&D landfill, which probably has another 20 years of life cycle on it, maybe longer depending on what the construction rates are, the demolition rates are of buildings and so forth around the county. So you'll see that site continue to operate until you close it or there's something other alternative. We also, in the early years of the county assuming the landfill operation, the landfill tipping fees paid for recycling costs, the initial recycling costs, until the time that the county implemented the separate recycling fee, the original landfill tipping fees. Both the C&D and the MSW paid for recycling. We also included in the general county's accounting process the operation of the convenience centers and later the sanitation operations that we have that support schools and county buildings and so forth. So the quote solid waste fund had all these issues combined. Now in each of the cases of those funds, each of them had separate revenue streams, separate responsibilities, separate liabilities. The landfill, the MSW landfill, has a 30-year post-closure obligation. When you shut the doors on the gates, you are responsible for any environmental improvements and the maintenance of the landfill for 30 years, unless you continue to own that land, and then you're responsible for it forever until such time as you cease ownership. So the reality of it is when we talk about a 30-year life cycle, unless you find somebody that wants to buy an old landfill, it's going to be a county responsibility forever. The MSW has similar requirements, except that it doesn't have the same types of materials in it and creates less of a problem. We had equipment requirements, debt, when you built the facilities out there. That was funded through the MSW and all the fees, the solid waste fees. As I said, until you had the recycling fee in place, it paid for most of the recycling costs. At some points in time, we were funding some of those, well, we've always subsidized the operations out of the county's general fund, either through the convenience centers and or the sanitation collection systems that we had. What we've tried to do is go back in history, and we did this basically at a request from the towns because they want to know, they believe that they would like to know all the accounting processes for solid waste. So your finance staff has spent a great deal of time and effort separating out, going back through all audits, and we provided them copies of audited statements and audited information from audits going back to the time the county took over the landfill. So the discussions we're going to have later will talk about audited numbers and analysis as we know them to be, subject to the final audit this year, which may make some changes. What comes, and these are the kind of the opening comments. Number one, raising landfill revenues by 10% each year will not, and I say not, cover the closure, post-closure costs, plus all of the Roger Roads improvements. That will not happen. And again, the landfill increases at 10% a year versus current area tipping fees. You see that now. We're now $14.50 higher than the Durham tipping rate at the gate, and we have lost the non-municipal customers to the Durham flow. The flow to the landfill has declined by 10% last year, which meant we raised the fees 10%, but the flow declined by 10%, so the end result will probably be a net no revenue gain. Roughly now, 27, well, today, or the most recent year ending in June of this year, 11 fiscal year, non-municipal revenues to the landfill accounted for 27% of the revenues the landfill received. The prior year it was 30%. So we're becoming more and more dependent on the municipal revenues. And again, as I said, private sector has started taking their flows elsewhere, their solid waste flows elsewhere. when we began to look at the issues, and we'll talk in a few minutes about the requests from the community, we started looking at the cost for water and sewer services. And I need to say this, first of all, the meetings we had with the towns and the legal staff of the towns indicated a willingness to fund water services and water connection fees up to the property line, with the property owner being responsible from the property line to the house, but all the fees and the connection fees and everything else. There was a willingness to fund all those water costs, including the Fox Meadow subdivision, which is the shaded area, out of landfill fees. Now, again, a lot of this came before we did all the analysis on landfill fees. And that's roughly a $4 million estimated expenditure. The Fox Meadow subdivision, and these numbers come from OWASA, is roughly a little over $2 million expenditure. You'll see that in your backup information. And a lot of that has to do because there are no water lines in that area, and you're putting in water lines substantial enough to have fire hydrants and provide that service as well. The remainder of the $4 million, about $1.8 million, is to service the remainder of all the areas where water lines were not extended within the Rogers Road area, and to provide service lines up to the property line for those people not now served. We did not seek out, because of the disagreement with the towns about using solid waste revenues to fund sewer extension, because of lack of a nexus between the sewer and the landfill. We didn't really seek it out, but I did confirm later with OWASA that to sewer the area of Rogers Road, including the Fox Meadow subdivision, is roughly an $8 million number. That's their estimate, and it may vary to some extent, but their estimate is $8 million for sewer and $4 million for water. We have looked at this, and quite frankly, I guess the best thing I can tell you is all that we've talked about is probably doesn't make any sense to rely upon solid waste revenues. Because if you use up the solid waste revenues to do the water system, you're going to be that much short on the closure, post-closure costs, which the towns are not accepting any liability for, which means we'll have to dig into the general fund anyway. So the reality of the improvements we're talking about, whatever they are, outside of operational improvements at the landfill and the cleaning up the illegal dump sites, probably need to be a general fund issue. And that can either be a general fund expense with a partnership with the towns, or the county assuming the liability and moving forward with the issue. The reality of it is you'd issue debt. The $18 million today, depending on whether you finance for 15 or 20 years, is somewhere between about $800,000 to $1 million a year in debt service, new debt service. That's not inconsistent with what you've done in the F1 area years ago. So, it's something the county has a history of doing in the past. The reality of it is you'd like to focus with the landfill. You can use the landfill as the basis for what you're doing, but the landfill doesn't have enough revenues to accomplish the task. So rather than use the landfill revenues to pay for it and reimburse the landfill out of the general fund, I would suggest to you dealing with the water and sewer issues, whatever you decide to do, whether you do water only or water and sewer, that needs to be a general fund consideration. And certainly, as we talk about later, you can discuss whether or not the towns want to be involved in that or whether you want to assume that liability. Parts of this have to do, too, with one of the issues that people talk about or have talked about is the life cycle of the landfill. With the differentials that we now have between the landfill, our tipping fees, and the tipping fees at the Durham landfill, and an inexact methodology today of measuring the transportation cost between wherever it's coming from, wherever the waste is coming from, to the Durham transfer station, I project too that there's probably not a whole lot of difference involved in those costs. If you're paying, if we're paying, and if all the municipal clients are paying the $57, and especially if we raise it by 10% again next year per ton, unless Durham, and even if Durham does raise their rates by as much as 10%, we're still escalating our costs faster than they are. And the methodology used in the past to measure the transportation costs were based on a point at the landfill to the Durham transfer station, rather than everybody looking at their routing systems and deciding how best to design their routes. So when the trucks, at the end of the day, when the trucks were full, they were closer to the northern end of the county or the eastern end of the county, and then could leave from there to go to the Durham station, reducing the time on the road that they were at, being, either the transit time or the staffing time and so forth. Now, there's some issues in our discussions with the town of Chapel Hill. They've already moved ahead with replacing some of their equipment with larger scale trucks that hold more waste than the others, and they're in a cycle of replacing equipment. I can't tell you what Carver has done. They didn't comment on it. The other discussion is that when we had our, as a matter of fact, this morning I had a discussion with the assistant city manager in Durham, and they indicated a willingness to have a longer term agreement with the county to accept the county's solid waste flows at whatever volume we agree to do it at, and to possibly have some type of discounted fee, gate fee, for the waste coming out of Orange County. It was from municipals, and so because they could build to one place and handle it that way and so forth. We discussed terms as long as 5 or 10 years, and we obviously there's a lot of particulars that have to be worked out, but at least from their perspective, they're in the process of evaluating remodeling their existing transfer station, adding on to it and so forth. So our flows will still be a small amount of their flows. If all the county flow went there, we're still only talking right now about 45,000 tons a year. So our flow would be a small point, but it would be enough maybe for them to decide to do something to improve the circulation around their transfer station. Having said all that, now we'll talk a little bit about the recommendations, and if you'll turn to the page in your meeting package that the recommendations are listed on. They begin, I believe, at the
page 6.
Bottom of page 6. And I say this, there's a couple things that we can do, regardless of whether you do it out of the general fund or you do it out of the wastewater fund, solid waste fund. The design time, right now these are all engineering estimates. The design time, an engineering firm would have to be selected to do the design of the water systems and so forth. And OWASA, it would be my recommendation, if you move forward at all with the water system, that OWASA becomes the person that manages the contract for us. The design for that water system extensions are probably going to be the 6 to 9 month range. So as we continue this dialogue or direction, whatever the board decides, if water, and I would argue, and I think the towns agree, that water is a reasonable assumption of public responsibility associated with the landfill. So if water is important, and we can go ahead and authorize at least the engineering associated with the water design to start that process. Again, that's a 6 to 9 month process, and they'll have to select an engineering firm. The sewer we can talk about in a minute. Authorize the dump site cleanups. That's a relatively inexpensive project. We gave you an outline of how we would do that. Now, we cannot relieve individual property owners of any liability for federal or state law violations. You don't have the authority to do that. And the way we propose to handle those is to hire private contractors, one or more, who will be licensed by the county to clean up the individual lots. The property owners will sign a release to allow the company to come on the property and clean the sites up and dispose properly of any materials on the site. Now, I need to point out to you that and I did in an email, that we've recently had a violation out there that a illegal dump site caught on fire, and it was one used by somebody who said they've been using that site for 15 years to dispose of waste. So there are people in that jurisdiction that are avoiding paying landfill fees and properly disposing of their waste. And it may not be their household waste, it could be old boxes or whatever else. But a lot of these dump sites may in fact be dump sites that are in active use by the residents out there. So as we go out and clean, if we go through a process where you authorize us to use landfill revenues to pay to clean up these sites, and per request from the neighborhood, then I think, you know, a very stringent enforcement process follows that. And people who fail to clean up their sites or through this program should be held accountable and responsible for cleaning up those sites on their own. It doesn't make sense to spend a lot of public money to go through the area and clean up the area and allow those other sites to exist. You have the same issues at hand. Again, items 3 and 4 on the next page in the recommendations. I can't tell you today that, and it's just one of those things if we continue to look at this, that it makes sense to keep the landfill. I can't tell you that it makes financial sense to keep the landfill open past its scheduled closing date of the spring of 2013. You know, obviously, if everybody's flows continue to go there and we increase the rates, we can generate revenue. But the towns, as well as the county, are paying for those tipping fees out of their general fund anyway. So, you know, the issue for everybody here is it's right now a general fund expense. So rather than dance around the legal issues associated with the enterprise fund, if the towns decide they want to participate and agree with you to participate, then they can do a general fund allocation to help cover debt services. If you decide you want to move forward, then move forward with a general fund allocation to handle debt services. That avoids a lot of, not only conflict with the towns over the landfill fees, but also with third parties who might actually file litigation to say you used the fees for something that wasn't associated with solid waste. And if they'd been hauling waste there for a long time, they would argue that their fees are being used for other than what you proposed them to be used for. Now, the reality of it is, I think our argument's pretty easy. It doesn't look like we're going to have enough money at the end of the life of the landfill to we're going to have to dig into the general fund to maintain the landfill going forward, or allocate a portion of recycling fees or C&D fees and so forth. But the reality of it is, as long as everybody around you is charging less than you are and people are free to take their waste to any of the landfills or transfer stations that are out there, raising your fees doesn't necessarily generate more revenue, as we've found out in the last year. Thus, I can't, you know, we can, and as I point out in section 4, you will need, we have not yet filed for an application to extend the life of the current landfill, and it's been on hold waiting for the board to kind of take the bull by the horn, so to speak. I think you took a position that it would not be extended beyond I think the meeting reflects you took a position that should not be extended beyond 2017, but we've not actually filed a permit. Now, we have to file a closure, post-closure plan with the state, and that needs to be filed. All that right now is in abeyance, waiting for you to give us some direction on what you want to do. The differential, I had some correspondence with the towns today. They have not, or at least not reached a point where they feel comfortable about their projections with regards to their transportation costs. The town of Carbo did indicate that they thought if we increased the fees again by 10%, we'd be getting close, that it wouldn't be much of a difference. So I don't know that we've got big differentials, again, because of the ways the fees were, the transportation costs were originally calculated. And I think what's extremely important here, beyond those two issues, and certainly we're looking for you to give us some recommendations or give us direction on the landfill closure date. And you have a request from the community of what they would like to see. But I think the big issue is that items 5 and 6 on page 7 are as important as anything else. Since I was here in the fall of 2009 when you took a position not to site a transfer station in the county, and I think everybody on this board was here except Commissioner McKee at that time. Since that time, we indicated a need to meet and have further discussion about what we're going to do. Since that time, there's been a lot of isolated discussions and efforts by individual board members and individual members of the various elected bodies and some private citizens groups, but there's been no formal discussions of where we're headed or what we're going to do. And it wasn't until we learned that we could, by changing the slope of the landfill, and we had this discussion at one of the I think one of the council of governments meeting that by changing the scope of the landfill, we found out we could increase the length of the landfill's life by up to four or 5 years. And that was the last really, as I remember, discussion we had, and that was only to indicate if we did that and filed for a permit increase, we could accomplish that. We've not had those discussions even about the Rogers Road as elected boards getting together. And while staffs get together and work on all the technical sides, and we may argue our points of view or the numbers associated with any particular item, the reality of it is an issue like this takes the elected leadership of both the county and the towns to get together and give us some direction. In the end, you have to assume the political decision-making process and tell us what it is that needs to happen. We've got extensive detail. We've done a lot of research, looked at a lot of things throughout this process. And while tonight no formal decision is required by this board, I think something in the form of a direction needs to be established pretty soon. The permitting process with the state to extend the landfill, I think, takes 3 to 6 months. I think I've heard something like that, 6 months time frame. So we don't want to wait till January of 2013 and think about extending the landfill further. And not only that, is every day we stay in operation and don't adjust the slope of the landfill affects the ability of the landfill to be extended anyway. Finally, there have been plans done by the town of Chapel Hill associated with the Rogers Road community, and I know there's been some joint planning involvement and interaction. There is a 60-acre tract of property known as part of the Green Tracts that was acquired by the landfill fund for future landfill expansion, not part of the jointly owned property, but a piece of property that's separately owned by the county. And that's an asset on the books for the solid waste fund, and could be, to address some of these financial needs, could be an item that could be sold for some, either affordable housing project or something else, or maybe used to connect some of the rest of the plan and site. There is a general plan that's not been adopted by anybody that talks about how land use on the jointly owned property could occur, but it's not, I don't think all the boards haven't officially adopted. The fact is, I sat in on a planning session with the town staff probably 6 months ago where they're revisiting that issue, trying to find a way to connect to Weaver Dairy Road, or somehow to provide access out of the Rogers Road neighborhood to stimulate cross-traffic allocations. We didn't do anything with that we didn't price it out or anything like that. It's been owned for quite a while. There are a lot of relevant issues. Some of the things that the Rogers Road Group asked for, like money to fund a operation of a community center. Well, that's not a proper landfill expense. That's something that group as a nonprofit could apply to the towns or county for annually, like we do now. We fund a lot of different nonprofit groups. The issue of the road signage and the speed bumps, that's an issue where we have to work with DOT, the appropriate places that they would allow those things to happen. We could do that, restrict traffic, but you have to have enforcement. Now, I want to remind everybody that half of this area, the Rogers Road, the area west of Rogers Road, is within the corporate limits of the town of Carborough. And the areas to the east of Rogers Road is part of the planning jurisdiction for the town of Chapel Hill. So the county's role in this does have to be, whatever happens to the land uses out there and whatever happens as far as any future activities, both towns take a primary role in that. There were some other requests associated by the group that are identified in here. One was having special taxing rates and those kind of things. And the problem with the concept there is almost all those types of arrangements within North Carolina are done on a voluntary basis because the landowner's restricting the value and the use of their property into the future. So while and they're available if they meet certain standards now, if they wanted to do certain things. So, and then also the issue of advocacy before the towns by the Board of Commissioners with the towns. I think there is a need for, and as I point out, there's a need for the political leadership to come together and establish some sense of directment and commitment, because in the end, whether the county goes ahead on its own without the assistance of the towns, or whether there's a partnership in that process, is going to have to be decided by the elected boards. We've gotten a lot of attachments. There's been a lot of involvement in this process by a lot of staff members. A lot of research has gone on. There's probably some things we haven't found yet that we're still looking for, but we've looked at different meetings, different old board meeting minutes, and trying to find resolutions or actions the board talk. It's not like you haven't talked about different things associated with this area several times over the years. It's just in many cases no specific action came out of those meetings. There was many times an agreement to meet again or pursue an issue further, but we've, and we're still tracking back. We're still trying to see if there's something we've missed, and there may be. I'm not arguing there is or isn't, but we tried to do a fairly thorough process. We've been somewhat surprised by the financial aspects of this, the whole landfill project and everything, to see that in reality, even though we have the highest landfill fees in the area, we've not set aside substantial enough reserves to cover the 30-year liability as dictated in the engineering studies. Now, some of that has changed in the last few years. The state has restructured, new organization, new regulations have come down, so the fact that the fees don't cover the post-closure costs are not necessarily a total lack of action on our part or recognition. At different points, the law changed, and we had, which inflated the costs further than they were before. And they need to continue to be reviewed. And like I said, I caution you again that if they change the rules on us in the future, those obligations stay with you as long as you own the landfill. We've had several staff members involved with this. We'll be glad to answer any questions and respond to any direction or comments you might have. And that concludes what I've got to say.
Do any board members have any questions of the manager for clarification, and then we'll go to public comments? Seeing none, there are a number of people who have signed up, and so let me call them. The first is Minister Robert Campbell, to be followed by Barbara Hopkins. As always, please limit your comments to 3 minutes. Commissioner McKee has the timer, and we have a number of people here, and what I expect will be a fairly lengthy discussion among the board members. So we ask that you adhere to that 3-minute limit as closely as possible. Thank you. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, the Chairman of the Commission and Orange County Commissioners. I'm Minister Robert Campbell from the Rogers Eubanks Neighborhood Association. The Roger Road community had been dealing with solid waste issues since the original landfill sited in 1972. A second landfill was sited in the mid-1990s. The recycling and transfer station and the construction and demolition landfill was sited around the same time. In addition to the toxic waste, there have been truck traffic, vermins, odor, and other impact that we just never grew accustomed to. Every time there's a plan for a new facility or a problem, the governments, first Chapel Hill and now the county, came to Roger Road with promises for new amenities. The garbage always followed, but the amenities never made it. Today, there are roughly 80 homes that remain of the original historic Rogers Road community. Only a handful have changed ownership since the landfill was first sited in 1972. We own our homes and pay county tax. To us, the original community is concentrated on Rogers Road, Pureford Drive, Sandberg Lane, and a few other properties adjacent to Rogers Road and Eubanks Road. It also includes families that are slightly to our west, off Link Lane and the Cradle property on Eubanks Road. Since the landfill was sited, additional communities, including Fox Meadow and Meadow Run Court, was added, and they have been good neighbors supporting our efforts to close the landfill and restoring quality of life to our community. Like us, they are impacted by the landfill, and many of their homes were built before the county sited the second landfill and other facilities. We appreciate the county's proactive action to run water lines to the entire community. But please understand, that was not part of our original request. Today, there is water service to most of the 80 homes in our community. Water was supplied with the landfill. Leachate failed in the early 2000s, and the threat to contaminate the water throughout the community. However, most of our family could not afford the $6,000 or $10,000 connection fee to the home to be serviced. Today, with the help of CDB grant and other resources, roughly half of our community is connected to Owassa's water. We believe that it will cost hundreds of thousands, not millions, to connect the rest. Today, 10 to 12 historic families have sewage service, and many of the old septic tank system is in disrepair or failing. It is the history and the status of water and sewage service in our community that provide the foundation for mitigation. And we are requesting tonight that you do the social justice thing, do the right thing. Just the water alone does not relieve the impact of this landfill on the quality of life and health for this community. Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara Hopkins, to be followed by Stan Sharon.
My name is Kathy Kaufman from Justice United. I'm speaking on behalf of Barbara Hopkins, who's a member of RENA, of the Rogers Eubanks Neighborhood Association, who could not be here tonight. In addition to water and sewer, our mitigation requests ask to clean up the illegal dump sites, provide startup costs for the community center, and improve the buffers between the landfill and our community to help block chronic odors, vermin, and other problems from the community. We appreciate the county's acknowledgement of these items in their report. We want to clarify what we're looking for. We like the plan to clean up the illegal dump sites. Just to clarify, we believe the problem is caused by garbage headed for all of the county facilities, not just the convenience center. With respect to the landfill buffers, please appreciate that the odor masking agents that have been used to date have been worse than the odors. Is it possible to find out what commercial landfill operators are using? Also, on landscaping buffers, we like the idea of a vegetative buffer, but please appreciate that we live on the other side. So please assure us that the buffer will be visually attractive and of sufficient size and density to shield the giant mound of trash on the other side. Thank you for considering our request for help with our community center. As you know, this unfulfilled promise dates back to the original contract for the landfill. RENA has been operating a community center for the last 2 years and now offers computer literacy and other job skills, summer enrichment camp, and of course the back to school bash. We are proud of the work we're doing and are working to extend our services to our new neighbors from the Habitat community. In this request, we are seeking your help with our own community resource. We are not asking for a county facility. We are asking for an unrestricted grant of $100,000 to $150,000 a year for 3 to 5 years to get started. We need to hire an executive director to help us with programs, grant funding, and other basics. Maybe you should think of it as economic development, because at its core, the center is essential to rebuilding our community and assuring that our adults and children have the skills and resources to thrive in the broader community. Of course, in addition to cleaning up the dump sites, the buffers, and the community center, we are seeking a date certain to close the landfill, as originally planned in 2013. We have been patient and feel that the landfill should be closed regardless of volumes, capacity, or other reasons to keep it open. Thank you.
Stan Sharon, to be followed by Bonnie Hauser.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Stan Charon, and I stand here tonight as a longtime member of RENA who has proudly joined forces with Justice United and Orange County Voice. I speak for the coalition of these three organizations when I say that we have a moral obligation to close this landfill now. Yes, there may be reasons to keep it open, but there are better reasons to close it. The Rogers Road community has graciously hosted our trash along with truck traffic, vermin, and other impact for over 40 years. It's time to end this and make it right. We realize it's not just the county's problem. We share this unconscionable burden with you. The towns do too. But we won't find the right answers until we start asking the right questions. Let's start by making it personal. Let's stop talking about county facilities, trash volumes, trucks and capacity, and tipping fees. Let's acknowledge that the county's toxic landfill has operated for 40 years at the direct expense of a single important community. Imagine yourself living for 40 years with a growing pile of garbage next door. Imagine learning that the leachate liner has been breached and your drinking water may soon be contaminated. Imagine that rather than watching your real estate values go up with the rest of the county, they don't. And that you are continually fighting for basic amenities like water and sewer and wondering if your home will be worth anything to your children. Just imagine that you live in the Rogers Road community and have to live with all this. This is what you and I are doing to this community every day that the Orange County landfill stays open. I love Orange County and cherish our stated values, but I cannot understand why we tell ourselves that we can't afford to close the landfill when we have not begun to estimate the real cost of keeping it open. RENA's mitigation request is a small gesture on an enormous debt, and it's payback time. It will still take years and years to fully restore the health and vitality to the community. And a final point. We realize that you may fear setting an unsustainable legal or policy precedent if you ask the county and the towns to pursue mitigation for Rogers Road. Nothing like this has ever been done for other communities. Please be assured that the precedent has already been set. We are confident that the county can safely establish policy that offers similar mitigation to any community who agrees to take on a similar burden for Orange County. Please close the landfill. Close it now, and finally make good on the debt owed to this community. Thank you.
Bonnie Hauser, to be followed by Stephanie Perry.
Hard one to follow. I'm Bonnie Hauser of Orange County Voice, and we're proud to join forces with RENA and Justice United. As we see it, the rural community shares the responsibility with town residents to assure that the landfill closes and that we finally fulfill our long-standing obligation to the Rogers Road community. Before I get into my comments, I did have a question on the manager's statement that maybe you'll ask. The report, Mr. Clifton said it'd be about $8 million for sewer. The report suggests that it's $3 to $4 million without the Fox Hollow community, so we are assuming that the $8 million includes the Fox Hollow community. So it's just a question. We are pleased to see that the county is getting its arms around the economics of the landfill, and we appreciate that we're all further along than we were when we first discussed it last spring. We also realize that the county has a substantial legal and financial obligation associated with this landfill whenever it closes. We know it's critically important to you, but as we see it, it is unrelated to the Rogers Road mitigation. As the county indicated in the report, even with a maximum annual tipping fee increase, the tipping fees will barely generate enough money to close the landfill and fulfill the county's obligations to the surrounding community. And that's without the Rogers Road mitigation. Plus, as the county clearly has indicated, once the monies go into the enterprise fund, it cannot be used for most of the mitigation items that RENA is asking for, especially sewer service, which, as you know, represents most of the cost. The county's report also explains that the tipping fees are coming out of unrestricted general funds, property taxes, and sales taxes. So why on earth would you take unrestricted funds and put them in use a tipping fee to put it in a restricted fund when you can't use it? So we say, why use tipping fees or the enterprise fund at all? And wouldn't it be better if we wanted to fund this mitigation to use unrestricted funds in a separate Rogers Road mitigation fund? So please consider some alternatives to increasing tipping fees. Instead, how about finding an option, as Mr. Clifton opened the door to, that would actually result in a lower tipping fee and put the difference into a mitigation fund for Rogers Road? I think Mr. Clifton also suggested floating a low interest bond jointly with the towns to fund the mitigation. We'd also suggest considering selling unused or underutilized property, including portions of the Green Tract. Deferring or eliminating capital projects that are currently committed would be another way. And of course, there's always efficiencies in the county's solid waste and other operations to reduce operating costs. These savings could all be redirected to Rogers Road, and we believe that if you spoke to the towns, you would find similar opportunities to free up funds for the mitigation. So please disconnect the discussion on tipping fees and extending the life of the landfill from the Rogers Road mitigation and begin to find other ways to fund it. Thank you.
Stephanie Perry to be followed by Stephen McCraw.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Perry, and I'm speaking for Justice United's coalition of 26 member organizations representing thousands of citizens in Orange County. We're proud to continue our work to seek environmental justice for RENA and to work in coalition with RENA and Orange County Voice. We thank you for listening to our speakers. As you can tell, there are still many questions that must be answered before you can comfortably move this forward. We appreciate that Orange County took over the landfill just over 10 years ago, but the problems we are discussing have been festering for 40 years. We hold no one to blame for the past. We only ask that you consider our perspective as you move this forward. We understand that you have no legal obligation to do anything for Rogers Road, and we certainly do not underestimate the significant legal and financial obligations you face to close the landfill. Nothing we have said tonight is intended to downplay the important responsibility you have to the citizens and the town governments. In that context, we ask that you finally call an end to the burdens that we have placed on the Rogers Road community. We realize that there might be some short-term financial impacts, but we cannot continue to deface our friends and our neighbors. As proposed, the mitigation actions are an overdue settling of accounts. Orange County, town governments, and our citizens have accrued substantial benefits for 40 years at the expense of one single important community. There is no legal or policy precedent that serves as a reference point for this program, since no community in Orange County has ever endured similar hardships. It's clear from the county's report that we all know what's needed. We can assure you the towns do too. There may be some differences of opinion, but mostly elected officials and our citizens need to be educated on what's going on and what options exist to make things right. It has little to do with tipping fees or extending the life of the landfill, and everything to do with how we believe that Orange County communities of any color should be treated. So the only question is how to get there. If you'll join us, we can work together to finally fulfill this obligation. We believe that we can get past discussions of tight budgets and other obstacles that interfere with what every one of us knows must be done. We can foster the important and difficult discussions that need to occur with the towns. With your commitment, we know we can finally make this happen. Please show us with words and actions that you are committed to work with us to move this forward in partnership with the towns and the citizens of Orange County. Thank you.
Stephen McCraw.
Hey, I'm Stephen McCraw. I live in the Fox Meadow neighborhood. Thanks for the opportunity to hear us tonight. I wanted to come up and share my recent experiences in the community. This issue sort of landed on my radar. I moved to Orange County a year ago from Wake County, and part of that is recognizing a nearly threefold increase in the property taxes that I pay. And just as I was getting my property bill last month, I also got the results of a water test done from the well on my property, which indicated that my drinking water contained arsenic at a level of 25 parts per million. Now, the acceptable level of arsenic recommended is 0.03 parts per million. And the data that I received from the town that did the test indicated that as on average, over a lifetime of drinking water at the levels of arsenic that are in my water, 1 in 30 people will develop cancer. That's a great concern to me. So, you know, the last thing I want is to realize that the decision to move to Orange County has caused my family, someone in my family, to develop cancer down the road, or any of the kids I see along Rogers Road playing who live and drink the water that's contaminated from the landfill nearby. So I wanted to come tonight and put in my plug for you guys to extend water out to the surrounding communities. I think it's the responsible thing to do for homeowners who live around a landfill, most of which contains construction waste, which, you know, has treated lumber that's full of arsenic. And so that's what I needed to say. Thanks.
Thank you. That's everyone that's signed up to speak, but I suspect there's 1 or 2 people who have not signed up and would like to speak, so please come forward.
Hello, my name is Will Raymond. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but I did want to bring up one point that Frank had brought up to you, which was the costs that you saw from OWASA are tabletop engineering estimates, and that the kind of price tag that we looked at before, if you remember a year and a half ago, obviously $8 million is quite substantially higher than that. And part of that is the area, and part of that is just because this is an engineering estimate. When you get in there, I would expect some of those numbers to move. I'd like to thank OWASA staff, by the way, for rapidly providing information on that particular topic. One other thing about the cost, which might not be quite apparent in your report tonight, is it doesn't really cover the cost of connecting people to the systems. And that could be rather significant. And I think part of that in mitigating that cost is going to have to be working with the neighborhoods and maybe getting people who are doing training to be plumbers or whatever to do some of this work to drive some of the cost out of the process. So you have to be really smart about it. It would be one thing to build the service, and then it would be horrible not to be able to connect to it because of the cost of that. And so just be aware of that. That is part of the whole financial picture. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public who would like to speak? Seeing none, we'll open it to questions and comments from the board.
Earl has his pen raised, and I'm waiting on Earl.
The question I've got, and I'm not exactly sure who to address it to, I've heard it mentioned that about half or a little bit more than half of what I'm going to refer to as historic homes, the pre-1972 homes in the area already own the water, the water system. And I guess what I'm asking is, how many more of these homes can we hook up as soon as possible on existing water lines without laying any more trunk lines or any more infrastructure? How many more can we actually, out of the remaining 40-odd houses, how many can we get hooked up with existing structure.
If you go to the information we provided you,
Attachment 4.
yes, sir. Let's see, I think it's attachment 4. The estimates that OWASA provided, attachment 4. Each of those charts give you a physical street address and connection costs. I think it's like $300,000 to connect. And I don't know, which of the houses or the historic houses or which ones that have been built since then, but roughly the first item there, first table, deals with about $300,000 of expenses. And now some of that includes extending some water line, service lines to the property line. The example, in a lot of ways, they ran the water line down an area and didn't necessarily run a service line off to the property line. So they got to come back in and do that. Some people hooked on originally and some people didn't. And if I could, I'd answer the other question. Ms. Hauser, the reason the sewer is $8 million and not $4 million is because that does include Fox Meadow plus the subdivision north on the north end of Rogers Road. It includes all those areas, so that's why the sewer costs went up. And again, there are less expensive ways to put sewer into that neighborhood, but OWASA doesn't like to use, they like to use a standard gravity system, so that their numbers are based, and their numbers are based on linear foot estimates based on, they didn't do it as physical design for each foot of the sewer system. They did a linear model which said, okay, our costs are X number of dollars a foot, and they ran the numbers. So a lot of it will vary by manholes and whether or not any of this area is below the road and needs a pump station, those kind of things. So, but they were found, they estimate those to be pretty good numbers. And the numbers here you see, and these reports only reflect water. They do not reflect any of the sewer. Because at the time we were thinking only of using landfill revenues based on the agreement of the towns. And when it became obvious that the landfill revenues were not going to be sufficient to do the closure, post-closure, and this, we said, okay, give me the number on sewer as well.
Commissioner Hammond?
Well, following on that, this is the list of the historic homes for $288,000, took all the rest of them up. Is that?
I believe so. We've done some more connections since then. We did some CDG connections, and there's been some other connections made, but I believe that, go ahead, Michael, you got more.
Yes, just to reference your map behind you, the light blue areas are where water is available and they're not yet hooked on. The dark blue areas represent the ones that are actually hooked on. You have an area in the center where you have a lot of lots for habitat development. They're paying those fees as they hook on. The community development block grant for this coming year is in light purple. I think there are 9 of those lots that are being connected in this fiscal year. And you have a yellow section which could be connected with additional extension of water lines. And all of that is located in what is known as the historic area.
Okay, so I'd like to stay on the one water issue now. Maybe we can work on, we've got lots of pieces of this discussion, so questions and concerns about the water issue. The Fox Meadow area was established when?
After it's a later subdivision, I think.
1980s.
In
1980s, just trying to get a feel.
1983 through about 1990.
Okay. So after landfill was there.
Yeah.
Part of my concern, I want to hook the historic neighborhood up to water. That is something that I feel very strongly about. But part of my concern is that if we do it out of county funding by itself, in Chapel Hill's and Carborough's jurisdictions, we're setting the stage for doing other programs like that. And I feel strongly that this really is a landfill issue coordinated for hooking the water on. That's just my viewpoint, and I think the monies, I would vote towards spending the $288,000 out of the landfill fees because of setting a precedent the other way. I think it ought to be paid for, but it's something that everybody's paid into. And if we set the precedent that we're going to come into jurisdictions and do this because we think we have the right to do so, I think that sets a precedent of non-cooperation down the line. That is just my personal feeling.
you already have that precedent set, that you did spend $600,000 to extend water lines in there, and it came out of the landfill fund.
It did come out of the landfill fund.
Yeah, that $600,000 came out of the landfill fund, and that's, now since that time, there's been some CGB money
Right.
to help people connect, but the $600,000 worth of water lines that were put out there came out of the landfill fund, and all the parties agreed to do that.
So it did not come out of directly county general fund, it came out of the landfill fund.
Came out of the landfill
Okay.
fund, right. So the precedent's there to do water, whatever you want to do with water. The real issue, I guess, that we were trying, as we looked at this financially, is that, if you have to make it up later when the landfill closes, you took the money out of landfill, either way, it didn't make any difference. It was still county dollars later on, unless the towns agreed somehow to participate.
Commissioner Jacobs.
Yeah, I just want to detour briefly to page 66 before I start talking about these issues. We have an analysis, I guess, this on page 66. Is this from the consultant or from our staff? The options with advantages and disadvantages.
Bill?
These options were prepared by our consultant, HDR Engineering.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that, because I can't tell you how inappropriate I think it is to count public involvement as a disadvantage to any kind of process. And that's repeated in this document in 3 separate places. Disadvantages, public involvement process. I think we should be clear with consultants as well as our own staff that public involvement is an advantage, not a disadvantage. This is where it is a democracy still, and I think we want people to be able to feel like we value their participation. And any consultant who thinks otherwise probably is not in tune with our values and shouldn't be hired by us.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Commissioner Jacobs, if you don't mind, can I just point out that we've had this discussion before, and I'm glad Commissioner Jacobs brought it back, because when we saw this report before, we made the same comments, and we asked that these comments not be included in any other of our documents where it related to processes as we involve the public. We've made those comments before, and I understand this is a repeat document, but again, it indicates that it was revised February 3rd. In our discussions back in April, we made comments to this effect, so I would like to second the comments that Commissioner Jacobs just made regarding these comments that were in this report when we saw it before and we're looking at it again.
Thanks.
I think, and your statements are appropriate. I think here and we'll have to verify this, I think what the consultant means is there's a public hearing process that's required if you take either one of those steps versus the other one being the first one being a step that the state doesn't require the public hearing process, so they can probably word it differently. But I mean, I don't think that the issue, I think that's what the consultant probably meant to say, and it's not what they, not the way it's interpreted.
And you explained that the last time, again, but we're seeing it
Still inappropriate.
Well, again, it's a historic document.
I did want to ask Mr. Wilson a question related to the main issue at hand. When was the leachate liner breached? We heard that stated a few minutes ago.
I'd like to hear that from the person who made it, because I'm not aware that's the case.
Okay.
So if the person who's made that statement could provide us with information, I'd be very interested in it.
When we provided water to the Rogers Road neighborhood, I remember we had extended conversations about whether or not there was a causal relationship between leachate from the landfill and water quality in the Rogers Road neighborhood. And staff said at that time that the monitoring wells showed that there was no contamination. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So is that still the case?
That is still the case based on our routine and ongoing monitoring program.
Okay. So as we talk about water, with all due respect to Mr. McCraw, I think there is a significant difference between how we regard Rogers Road and Rogers Road Water and even Rogers Road Water and Sewer, and how we regard Fox Meadow and other subdivisions, and what our obligation is as a unit of government, as the landfill may or may not relate to their need for water and sewer. The main thing I wanted to say is that a lot of these issues, and the manager pointed it out in items number 5 and 6, require us to have a meeting with the other governments. Maybe we could call it a government assembly instead of an assembly of governments, and people will think it's something new, and they'll want to actually attend. But we're overdue for a meeting to talk about these issues, to talk about Rogers Road and what our joint obligations and commitments are, to talk about the Green Tract. And I did contact staff today because I think Commissioner Gordon, you and I may have been the only ones on the board when this was discussed, but it was very important to the municipalities, as it was to the commissioners at that time, that the 60 acres of the Green Tract that were set aside for the county's ownership would be maintained as open space. Now, we've had trouble finding documentation of that, but I would suggest that that should be part of a conversation with the other governments, because there were some people who distrusted that Orange County would stick to that commitment to such an extent that they demanded we have a conservation easement with Triangle Land Conservancy, which we then also never followed through on. So I think it's not an issue to be taken lightly. I also think the whole issue of what we're going to spend general fund versus landfill fund, solid waste enterprise fund, should be part of a conversation with the municipalities. Yes, everybody pays into both of those funds, but they do it differently, and we will, as a governmental entity, we will have different impacts depending on how that money is spent. I think we need to talk about joint approaches to waste disposal. If we're a group, we have way more leverage than if everybody's on their own. If another modality comes up and we can bring to the table more waste, we have more leverage. And I think we need to address issues of contamination. People are convinced. I'm not the person here who monitors the water, and I'm not the person here who drinks it. But people are convinced that the landfill has contaminated their water, besides the fact that it's degraded their quality of life in other ways. And I think we need to address that, again, for all the government officials to hear. Most of them weren't even at the table when we jointly decided in the early 2000s to provide water. We were very specific in saying it wasn't tied to contamination caused by the landfill, but we nevertheless felt obligated to provide quality water to the neighborhood, because people would, Bonnie Norwood would bring her bottles of water, which were opaque, and that was from her well, and it just didn't seem right. So to me, those are that's where we ought to be going next, is having that conversation, bringing to bear those issues. I'm sure other people can think of other issues, but I think this ought to be done relatively soon. I don't know if we could schedule a meeting before the end of this calendar year, but we certainly ought to do it, if not early next calendar year, so that we can actually move on with some of these decisions and figure out, if we're gonna uncouple our spending from the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund, there's less of an argument against contributing to a community center. If it's linked to the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund, there's more of an argument against doing some of these ancillary things that may be beneficial to the community. So these things need to be discussed, I think, fully with all the other elected officials who are stakeholders, and then we could all move forward with hopefully some kind of consensus.
Commissioner Fushi.
I agree with all of the points that Commissioner Jacobs just made, but for just a moment, I really would like to separate the remediation process from landfill closure and all of the other stuff. Because I've been on this board now for about 7 years, and for the better part of 5 years, from the discussion on siting a transfer station to getting to a point in April where we could talk about landfill impact remediation, we have been discussing this issue. And this board committed itself to direct staff to research and communicate and, to the extent possible, collaborate with the towns to come up with a plan for remediation. And let me just say thank you for the work that you've done. I think you've put out a great effort to bring back the kind of information that we requested back in April. The one thing that we have always known, which is probably why all of the governmental entities have been reluctant to move forward, is that this process and any resolution would be expensive. The residents of Rogers Road have been told for 40 years it's going to cost a lot of money to do this. We have to identify a revenue source to do this. We have to be careful how we do this. And so we knew the process was going to be difficult. And earlier, when we recognized the poet laureate, he talked about how nobody wants to spend more money in taxes, but there are certain things that we want that we have to pay for. I don't want to go there yet, but I do want to say that knowing that it was going to be expensive does not preclude us from moving forward. I think the commitment that we made publicly back in April is a commitment that we cannot renege on. And so, you know, moving forward can happen before we communicate with the towns in a manner as to what they're going to do. Again, I have always said that the county, and this board committed to that the county move forward to do the things that we think that we can do. So just for a moment, I want to talk about the historic Rogers Road neighborhood. And I want to talk about us providing water initially, and not just bringing the lines to the property line, but paying for those connections for the remaining families in that area, as we said we would do. I think to say that, or to indicate that we're willing to negotiate and pay for getting the lines to the property lines is just like putting a sandwich about a mile away from a hungry person and saying, now you get it. Because we know that what has stopped some of these folk when we did it, when we paid the $600,000 before, was that they could not afford to pay for the connections. So I don't even want to talk about it. If we can't talk about paying for the connections, there's no need to just talk about what OWASA can do to the property lines. I just don't want to go that route. We talked about the tipping fees, and now we understand that those fees are going to decrease, that we have closure and post-closure obligations that require at least $12 million. We have about that much money now. We know we have to do that. Let's stop talking about being able to use that money for that process. We can't do it. So it means that we have to identify another revenue source. That's what we need to talk about. And because we know that we're not going to be getting enough tipping fees to do that, why should we even talk about keeping the landfill open beyond 2013? I mean, that's a decision that we can go ahead and make, because it's not going to bring us any money to do any of these things. We have that obligation. We know that that money is in hand. Anything else we get, we're going to have to save it for any other costs that are related to closure and post-closure. I would hope that As I have so many notes here because I've heard so much tonight that I didn't expect to hear that I don't know where to start. But I do know that as Commissioner Jacobs has said, Commissioner Hemiger has said before, at some point, in some way, that we can get the towns to come to the table and talk about what we do as next steps is going to have to come pretty soon. Because what we also know is the longer we put this off, the more expensive it becomes. And so to talk about some things that look good and may make us feel good to do that we cannot do, and we have not had the same obligations to those residents as we have to those 80 homes in the historic Rogers Eubanks neighborhood, we need to do that. And I'll stop there because I just don't know where else to go on these notes. But I do know that we need to talk closure as soon as possible.